In this Blender video, I'm going to demonstrate how to make orbs that follow the terrain of an alien planet. The terrain that I'll be using is from another one of my Blender videos. I'll put a link to it in the video description in case you want to make a terrain similar to this. If you have your own terrain, then that should work too. For this video, I'll be using Blender version 2.82a. The size of this terrain is 2 meters by 2 meters. I'm going to start by scaling it up in size by pressing S, then 10, then Enter. The reason that I'm doing this is because the movement of the orbs will look better when moving across a larger surface. When I tried using a smaller terrain with the orbs scaled down in size accordingly, the orbs would pop up off the terrain when they encountered certain terrain features. With everything scaled up in size, it worked the way that I wanted it to. If you made the terrain by following my video tutorial, then there should be a Decimate Modifier in the Modifier tab. Apply this modifier. This will greatly speed up the simulation time later on. Now press Shift-A and add a mesh sphere. This is going to be our orb object. Smooth it out by right-clicking and select Shade Smooth. Then move it out of sight below the terrain by pressing G, then Z, then drag it down and left-click. Now press Shift-A and select Empty and then Plane Axis. A little later, we're going to set up the orbs to move toward this empty object. Next, move the empty to the side by pressing G, then Y, then -5, then Enter. It may be a little hard to see, but it's right here. We're going to use a particle system for the orbs, and so we need an object to emit the particles from. So press Shift-A and add a mesh plane. Move it close to the corner of the terrain by pressing G, then X, then 8, then Enter. Then press G again, then Y, then 6.5, then Enter. This will be the starting position of the orbs. Now we'll add a particle system to it. So switch to the Particle tab and click the plus button. Each particle will be an orb, and I want there to be 10 orbs, so I'm going to set the number of particles to 10. I want all of the orbs to be present at the beginning of the animation, so both the frame start and end values should be set to 1. To make sure that the particles will be visible for the whole animation, set the lifetime value to 1000. Now open the Physics section and set the Physics type to Voids. Voids is an amazing physics type which is used to simulate the movement of a group of living things, like a flock of birds or a school of fish. In our case, we're using it to simulate the movement of our orbs. And when things are set up properly, the orbs will automatically follow the contours of the terrain. Now open the Movement section. We don't want the orbs to fly, but we do want them to move on land, so remove the check mark from Allow Flight and add a check mark next to Allow Land. To allow a little extra space between orbs, increase the land personal space value to 1.5. Next, open the Void Brain section. This is where we can give the orbs some rules to follow. The Separate rule causes the orbs to move away from each other. We're not going to use the Flock rule, so delete it. Then press the plus button and add a Follow Leader rule. This tells the orbs to follow a leader object that we specify. To specify the object to follow, select the empty object that we added earlier from this drop-down list. Later, when we run the simulation, the orbs will move toward the empty object, and then after reaching it, they'll continue moving around in the area. Next, open the Render section. We want the particles to be rendered as the sphere object that we added earlier. So change the Render As value to Object. Then for the instance object, select the sphere. Set the size of the spheres by changing the scale value to 0.3. We're emitting the particles from the plane that we added. To prevent the plane itself from being visible in the animation, remove the check mark from next to Show Emitter. If I play the simulation now, you'll notice that the orbs move, but they're not following the contours of the terrain. To make them follow the terrain, select the terrain, switch to the Physics tab, and click the collision button. Now when I play the animation, the orbs follow the contours of the terrain. Next, we're going to set up the orbs to emit light. So select the sphere from the outliner, switch to the Material tab, and click the New button. Change the surface type to Emission. If you want to use the same color that I'm using, then set the color to a hex value of FF9959. I want the orbs to cast a lot of light, so I'm going to set the strength to 20. Now switch to the shading workspace. I'll switch to rendered view so that we can see what the light from the orbs looks like. You'll notice that when an orb passes in front of another orb, you're not able to see its outline where they overlap. So we're going to make some changes so that it will look like this. The changes consist of adding 3 more nodes. So press Shift-A and select Shader, and then Mix Shader. Drop it on the output of the emission shader. Then press Shift-A and select Shader, and then Diffuse. Connect it to the bottom input of the Mix shader. Set its color to black. Now to control the factor input, press Shift-A and select Input, and then Layer Weight. Connect the facing output to the factor input. The Layer Weight node will control the Mix shader so that the Diffuse shader will be used for the portion of the orb surface that's angled away from the camera. In other words, the Diffuse shader will be used for the outline of the orbs. For the blend value, you may want to experiment, but I think that a value of 0.7 works well. Now switch back to the Layout workspace. We're going to be baking the particle simulation. To control the number of frames that will be baked, I'm going to set the end frame value to 401. This value also sets the number of frames that will be rendered. The reason that I'm setting it to 401 instead of 400 is that I've noticed that when I render the animation after baking, that the orbs in the last frame are not rendered. So I'll bake it with a value of 401, and then I'll change it to 400 before I render it. To bake it, select one of the orbs, switch to the Particles tab, open the Cache section, and click the Bake button. It doesn't take very long to bake. It's done baking now. If you need to make any changes after baking, then click the Delete Bake button, make your changes, and then bake it again. Next, I'll change the end frame value to 400. For the lighting, we're only going to use the orbs to light the scene. If you have another light source present, then select it, switch to the Object Data tab, and set the strength to 0. There will be a very small amount of light produced by the stars in the background, but it will not really be noticeable. This is what the rendered animation looks like using the Cycles render engine with 50 render samples. The orbs are following the contours of the terrain, and they're bright enough to cast a nice amount of light onto the terrain. If you don't know how to render an animation, then you can watch my video on that topic. I'll put a link to it in the video description. Well, that concludes this video. Thanks for watching, and please subscribe and leave a comment.